Today, a federal judge ruling against Donald Trump's accounting firm and ordering them to hand over years of financial records to House Democrats. Then separately, the White House announcing it is directing former White House counsel Don McGahn not to testify. That is to say, they're telling him to skip the subpoena ordering him to testify tomorrow in Congress. And then moments ago, we just learned that Donald Trump's former lawyer, Michael Cohen, is pointing fingers at Donald Trump's current lawyer. He is accusing Trump lawyer Jay Sekulow of something quite serious, of instructing him to lie to Congress, a felony, about those infamous negotiations and when exactly they ended over trying to build a Trump Tower, Moscow. Take a look at this. Sekulow blasting back moments ago, saying this is more of the same from Cohen, although he did not directly deny the substance of these new allegations. That's leaking from Cohen's testimony under oath to the House Intelligence Committee. So with all this breaking news, I am going to go right to our panel. Reverend Al Sharpton, host of Politics Nation here on MSNBC. Richard Sangl, who served in the Obama administration as a diplomat and is also, of course, a longtime Washington watcher. He was managing editor of Time magazine. And New York Times editorial board member Mara Gay. Good to have each of you here. With so much going on, I wanted to get your first reactions to this news, including the Democrats having laid out a strategy to appeal to the courts for help if they say there's stonewalling. What does it mean that they have a judge ordering the accounting firm to hand over this material?
Yes, Judge Mehta, in his 41-page decision, had an extraordinary statement where he said it is not fathomable that the Constitution allows Congress to investigate a president for malfeasance, but not allow Congress to investigate him for that criminal conduct. It encapsulates it in one beautiful phrase, and I think this is what we've been looking at all along, Ari. This is the checks and balances between these two areas of the law, of the judiciary branch and Congress, and the judiciary branch has come in favor of the Constitution.
And Mara, what does it mean when you say to an accounting firm, I guess you could try to disobey this. You would soon be in contempt of court. And unlike Mr. Barr and Mr. Trump, who have special jobs, if an accountant wants to do that, they'd be in jail on contempt day of.
Absolutely. I think it shouldn't take such an extraordinary measure, but it's important, especially given the political polarization that we're living in right now, because to have a second branch of government weigh in and say, actually, yes, this is the right thing to do. You know, Americans see the judiciary branch as less politicized, although that's not always the case. But I do think it's important. It lends credence to Congress at a time when Americans' faith in government is really breaking down along whether you're a Democrat or Republican, and that's unfortunate. But I think it's an important step.
And Rev, this comes as I was just mentioning to Steve Kornacki that you had a Congressman Cicilline on Meet the Press Daily saying, look, he wasn't necessarily at the impeachment point, but if there's total stonewalling, if they blow through this subpoena for McGahn tomorrow, then he thinks it is time to step forward on impeachment. Do you see that as an outlier or something that some House Democrats want to do as the next step?
I think that they are certainly moving very quickly in that direction. And I think that when you look at the fact this judge hit the core problem that I think many are missing, this is beyond partisan politics now, which side of the aisle. We're talking about the basic construct of what the government of the United States was founded on, checks and balances. And he reminded people of that in his decision, that Congress has the right, they're co-equals. And he spoke to the core of that. I think that's going to also overlap into other areas because congressmen and women are now going to have to say, wait a minute, am I now going against the fundamentals of checks and balances here, which changes the whole tenor now, because I think what has been going on so far, the Trump team has tried to make this partisan. This judge has been able to, in many ways, raise it above that and say, wait a minute, they have the right to investigate in order to see if there's a necessity of checks. Well, and I think that that is a very significant step.
Well, and when you put it like that, it would be easy to forget, partly because I think we have a president who tweets his way into wanting everyone to forget that we are in the very early period of divided government. Before this, there wasn't a Republican House that was demanding much of everything. And although Reverend Sharpton doesn't always echo Republicans and vice versa, what you're saying is similar to what some Republicans were saying here in this Politico article out today. Basically saying, look, we have oversight authority over the administration. There is such a thing as congressional oversight, that Republicans have become increasingly concerned in this period where they don't know if they're 2 years out from under 2 years out from a Trump reelect, or going back to a different world and saying, is this going to be an era that defined Congress out of the entire governing process?
That is exactly right. And where President Trump and his team has done is really render oversight into undercut. And I think this judge began turning the dial back the other way. And I think that this may be very perilous for the president, along with turning over the financial records if there's something there. And clearly one would suspect he had a reason for resisting this.
I don't even know if he did. Because
Well,
here's the thing. This is why I try to keep an open mind. There were times in the Russia part of the Mueller investigation where you thought they're lying so blatantly, it must be bad. And I say in all fairness, although lying is bad, sometimes they were lying out of a habit or out of a stonewalling or out of just a desire to potentially obstruct, which is not okay, but did not mean that there was the underlying offense, at least in a provable way. And so I pressed you on that, and all three of you take a listen to, as I mentioned, Congressman Cicilline putting this in the starker terms. This was just within the last hour on MSNBC. Take a look.
If Don McGahn doesn't testify, it is time to open an impeachment inquiry. The president has engaged in an ongoing effort to impede our ability to find the truth, to collect evidence, to do our work. And this is preventing us really from ultimately finding the facts.
So I would say what we're seeing is the institutional privilege asserting itself, right? Congressman saying, this is against my branch. And what I would say also about Don McGahn is he's a private citizen. For years, White House aides have resisted and said there's immunity for testifying. But he's not a White House aide anymore. He's a private citizen. And I would also ask, Ari, Jones Day, his employer, the well-regarded Washington law firm,
sure,
would they like one of their partners to resist a congressional subpoena? Subpoena, as you know, means under penalty. He will be penalized if he resists it, as will the law firm.
And what is he afraid of at this point?
Well, I don't know what he's afraid of. We know what Donald Trump is afraid of. Donald Trump is afraid of the truth. Donald Trump is afraid of him saying, yes, I got a call at home from the President of the United States asking me to fire the special counsel. If that's not grounds for impeachment, I don't know what is.
And I don't want to go meta here on television talking to you about the power of televised hearings. Right. But it would seem, for those of us who've given a careful reading and reporting of the Mueller report, which we've tried to do, that I don't believe that Mueller did such an incomplete job interviewing McGahn, his most cited witness, that there's a bunch of stuff that McGahn would say that is factually new. It appears that the Trump folks, and maybe McGahn, I can't say because we have to wait to hear from him, are worried that it would be the act of having that John Dean-style moment, of saying it to the committee, of everyone hearing it and seeing it and it playing around America, that might undo some of what perhaps Barr did in mischaracterizing the report.
Oh, that's exactly right. I mean, if you compare what my parents say happened during Watergate and those hearings, and you contrast that with the release of the Mueller report, which most Americans, let's be honest, are not going to sit there and read the 400-page report. You can really you see the difference between the kind of power, political or otherwise, that exercise holds. And I think also just for a modern day example, the Kavanaugh hearings, the entire nation just was held captive. For a week, a day, essentially, watching this, talking about it. And you didn't see that with the Mueller report. And so the Democrats have an opportunity, and I think more importantly, Congress has an opportunity and an obligation to show the American people what the Mueller report has found, and beyond that, what those who testify can tell the American people about what happened here.
Because, Rev, on the elements of obstruction, there are two types of questions when you look at the allegation. Number one is the facts. Did Trump try to improperly fire or oust Mueller? Right? Then there's, what are you going to do about it? And quite frankly, I'll hold both parties accountable. So far, both parties in Congress have basically said it doesn't look like we're going to do anything about it. And that's their elected representatives. They can decide that. But on part one, right, what even happened? You had Bill Barr go on Fox News and try to say, and I thought this was astounding, and we covered it, that it didn't happen. That he didn't really try to fire Mueller, that he really was interested in doing a conflicts check. And that didn't really happen. And, Don McGahn packing up his bags and calling his criminal defense lawyer because he was worried he was going to go to jail if he didn't stop this thing. None of that happened. And that's the sitting Attorney General of the United States.
And the fact that they were saying that it didn't happen and it did leaves all the more reason why Congress has to now aggressively deal with looking at the financial records and as well as looking at what has been said here. And I wouldn't rush too far into saying that because Mueller had done these 30 hours of interviews with McGahn and others that we know everything, because if in fact there was obstruction, we don't know what we don't know. You don't forget, as you reported, Michael Cohen just said that the president's attorney told him to lie. Well, who else went in there and
You're
was
telling me not
instructed
to
lie?
forget that. How can I not forget it if I don't know it, Rev?
But that's my point. We don't know if someone was instructed or for whatever reasons didn't tell the whole truth or told a whole lie, and that was based on the obstruction. So you've got to deal with the obstruction to really find out if we know everything we should know about the collusion.
I think you put that well, and that brings us to Congressman Justin Amash, who is a libertarian Republican, member of the Republican Party. I want to read to you a little bit of what he laid out this weekend. He said, after really studying this Mueller report, there are multiple examples of conduct satisfying all the elements of obstruction of justice. Undoubtedly, any person who's not the president would be indicted based on such evidence. He goes on to say impeachment, a special form of indictment, does not even require probable cause. I think this is so important for where we're headed because the reverse engineering of this question has been used by, again, Republicans to say, we don't care, we'll do whatever we want. He's fine in the Senate. But it's also been used by many Democratic leaders to say, what's the point? And so speaking to you in your role both as a journalist and a former diplomat dealing with the credibility of the government, doesn't it matter, wouldn't it be better for the Congress to deal with a finding of whether or not these obstructive acts occurred, even if we don't know or we stipulate perhaps he would not be removed over it?
Absolutely. That's their investigative function. And I think what's interesting about Amash is this. He's a conservative Republican. Friedrich Hayek is his idol when it comes to economics. The fact is, what Trump has done in terms of obstructing justice and executive overreach is exactly the sort of thing that traditional conservative Republicans are against. And they have gone along with it all along. He might be the tip of the iceberg because he's objecting to it on not just ideological grounds, but on grounds of executive overreach, which conservatives object to.
Rich Stengel, Mara Gay, and Reverend Al Sharpton, thanks to each of you for a very hot panel. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.